Hello students, welcome to the MOOC course on Introduction to Sociology 2. Today our topic is the classical conflict theorists. Now, the conflict theory started how and when. So let us start with a little bit of history. As a reaction or alternative to the structural functionalist theory, conflict theory arose. Now, after the criticism of functionalism, some of them tried to integrate the concern for structure with an interest in conflict. This led to the development of an alternative, which was the conflict theory. The initial statements of the conflict theory were formed in mid-1800s by the German thinker Karl Marx. Now, who were these people who were talking about the conflict theory? Who were the conflict theorists during the classical period? Firstly, obviously Karl Marx, then Max Weber, G.W. Sumner, and George Simmel. Of course, there were others too, but these were the most significant ones. So, today we will discuss these thinkers. So, this is Karl Marx. We will first talk about Marx's life and his works. Karl Marx was a philosopher, he was a social theorist, and he was an economist. He perceived himself as a marginal individual. The general backwardness plus the repressive governmental measures led to a spiritual malaise in entire Germany. He wanted to critique the existing order. How? By uncovering the working class's reality, real situation. He wrote on topics related to economics, political economy, and society, often in collaboration with the social theorist and his friend Friedrich Engels. Most significant work of Marx were the 1848 pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, and the Das Kapital, 1867 to 1883. Now, Karl Marx completely based his theories on economistic determinism. So, what do I mean by economistic determinism? So, for everything, he ultimately fell back on the economic reasons. He said that the economy was the base of the society and everything was ultimately shaped and it changed, it was influenced by the economy of the society. He talked about capitalism, whose main feature was profit making by exploiting a section of the society. And following this exploitation, he talked about class struggle or class conflict, eventually which led to a larger revolution to change the existing order. Now look at this diagram. This is the diagram of his theory of class struggle. Now Marx said that society was basically divided into two parts. The base, which was the economy, and the superstructure. So everything else in the society other than the economy fell into the superstructure. So state, religion, ideology, art, literature, everything. Now, he did not focus much on this superstructure part. As he was an economist himself and he believed in economist determinism, so he discussed in very deep detail about the economy, about the base. He said that there were the means and forces of production, the machines, the capital, and so on, and the relations of production. So everything that was produced had some relationships, human relationships, interactions involved in it. So he divided relationships of production into two main classes. First was the propertied class, which he termed as the haves, who owned the means of production, and the other was the property-less class, whom Marx called the have-nots, who did not own the means of production but worked for those who owned the means of production. Ones who owned the means of production, they kept on exploiting the workers. Now, this exploitation, continuous exploitation, obviously led to some tension, some frustration, some irritation within the exploited have-nots, the workers. However, they did not express it to each other. It was inside them. But it was building up. So at this stage, Marx calls them class in itself. Post this phase, after a little bit of time, maybe some worker disclosed his discontent, dissatisfaction with the system of exploitation that they were facing. And then the other worker, another have-not, another exploited person, kind of identified and said that yes, even I am feeling the same thing. So he's also feeling the same thing. Maybe we all are feeling the same thing. So what happens? The conflict at the ideological level comes to surface at the physical level. So now they gain class consciousness and become class for itself. So a class in itself becomes class for itself with the addition of class consciousness. Now this physical conflict or revolution, Marx believes, would bring about a new society where there would be the proletariats ruling. As Marx talked mainly about capitalism, so he talked about the two classes, bourgeois or the haves, the owners of means of production, and the proletariats, the workers, the have-nots or the non-owners of the means of production. So he said in this new society, finally, the proletariats would start ruling. So this was his entire structure in one diagram where Marx's theory of class struggle has been clearly explained. Next, we come to talk about another very, very significant theorist, Max Weber. So first let us see his life and works. He also was a German sociologist and political economist. He had varied kind of experiences as a soldier, a professor, a politician, a legal expert, and also as a sociologist. He talked about Verstehen. His method was Verstehen, which was basically interpretive sociology. What was it? He said that the world is different, is subjective to each of us. We give individual meanings as we understand the world, separately, individually. As for his theories, Weber's theories, he talked about ideal types. He talked about bureaucracy, and he talked about social action and authority, where he differentiated between traditional, charismatic, and rational legal actions. The significant works of Max Weber were The Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, which he wrote in the 1930s, and The Economy and Society, which he wrote in 1968. Now, Weber said that there were mainly three main sources of conflict. So, Marx, what did he say? He said the main source was only one, economy. Differences, inequalities in ownership of property, exploitation, surplus generation, profit-making, capitalism, everything for Marx generated from the economy. However, for Weber, it was not so. He said there were three main sources of conflict: economic, social as well as political. Weber refined Marx's conflict theory and also applied it to the power dynamics beyond the inequalities of the rich and poor, beyond the economic class system that Marx stressed on. More than one conflict over property existed at any given moment in any given society. That was his argument. He actually included the emotional aspect of conflict too. For him, authority, which was legitimate power, power plus legitimacy, were of three main types. Charismatic authority, which generated from the social source, which depended on the charisma of the ruler. Traditional authority. So, traditionally, we keep on believing and accepting, conforming to the authority of some traditional gurus, some traditional elders, and so on. And rational legal authority. So, the authority which is generated by law or by reason. So, here, what becomes important, significant is that he laid stress and importance on the importance of not only economic class, but of social status or social position as well as political party. So, this was basically what Max Weber talked about in his conflict theory. So, the next sociologist, very important thinker in the conflict theory, is George Simmel. So, first let us look at his life and then works. Simmel too hailed from Germany, and he was a German sociologist and neo-Kantian philosopher whose fame rests chiefly on the works concerning sociological methodology. So his work focused mainly on the methodological side of the sociological work. Simmel worked on personal and social interaction, inspired the development of qualitative analysis in sociology. His major works, 1890 on social differentiation, 1892 The Problems of the Philosophy of History, 1892 to 1893 Introduction to the Science of Ethics, 1900 The Philosophy of Money, and 1908 Sociology Investigations on the Forms of Association. Simmel argued conflict is necessary for unity, which can also lead to social change. Now, see, when we talk about conflict in general terms, it breaks the unity. It is disharmony, right? Now, Simmel comes and says that conflict is necessary for unity, which can also lead to social change. Now, it usually helps in integrating and stabilizing a society. It can be positive, with the ability to strengthen the social relationships. Now, what happens is that suppose there is one society where internally there might be disunity. However, when people from another society wage a war against them, then the society that I was talking about before, even the ununited, even the people who are in conflict, they all become united, they become integrated against the external force. So here what is happening? Actually, the conflict is helping to build the unity within this society. The intensity of the conflict varies depending on the emotional involvement of the parties, the degree of solidarity within the opposing groups, and the clarity and limited nature of the goals. This is very important to understand, that what determines the intensity of the social conflict. How violent it will be, how intense it will be. So firstly, emotional involvement of the parties. So if the parties are extremely emotionally invested, emotionally involved in that issue or for that goal that they are fighting for, then obviously the intensity will be more. Next, the degree of solidarity within the opposite groups. So how integrated, how much solidarity is there within the internal part of each of the parties to the conflict. Just now that I said that if it has more solidarity, if it is more united, then obviously the conflict intensity will be more. If it is less united, if it is disintegrated kind of a society, obviously there won't be much of a intense conflict. Finally, the limited nature of goals that also determines how intense the conflict will become. George Simmel distinguished 4 main types of conflict. Firstly, war, battle. Next, feud. Next, litigation. And finally, conflict of impersonal ideals. Simmel here talks about domination. Domination is a form of interaction that engages superordination and subordination. So somebody is more powerful, superordinating, and somebody is subordinated. He also considered authority and prestige as a form of domination, which involved domination form of interaction. Next, we go on to the theorist W.G. Sumner. He was not a German thinker. He was an American sociologist and economist, and he publicized social Darwinism to a great extent. He taught at the University of Yale from 1872 to 1909. He viewed competition for property and social status as resulting in a beneficent elimination of the ill-adapted and the preservation of racial soundness and cultural vigor. He wrote Folkways, a study of mores, manners, customs, and morals, another very important work of Sumner, War and Other Essays. Now, Sumner was a social Darwinist and conservative in thought. Sumner worked continuously in charting the evolution of human customs, folkways, and mores. So how did the human social customs, folkways, mores, which are norms, how did they evolve? How did they change? How did they impact the people? So he constantly kept on charting these evolutions, these gradual changes. These forces developed naturally, spontaneously through the course of evolution. So, even if there were attempts to make social reforms, because of these natural, automatic, continuous change, which is evolution, the social reforms were becoming useless. The attempt at social reforms, Sumner argued, was becoming completely futile and useless. The wealthy were rich because of natural selection, because he believed in Darwinism, remember? So he said that the wealthy were rich. Why? Because of natural selection. They were selected naturally, as Darwin talks about natural selection, and argued that their wealth was a social service. Sumner argued that hereditary wealth allowed the fittest to pass on their virtues to their children, to the next generation. Remember, Darwin talked about survival of the fittest. So this was basically what Sumner felt, what Sumner argued, what he believed about social conflict. So now we saw all the four theorists who are very significant, starting from Karl Marx, who started with the conflict theory, going on to Max Weber, who talked not only about the economic class as per Marx, but refined it with economic, social, and political causes. Then we came to talk about Sumner as well as Simmel. After we have talked about these conflict theorists, let us see how they were criticized. Firstly, conflict theories fail to capture the way in which economic interactions can mutually benefit the different classes involved. It is not that the entire profit or the entire gain is for one class and the entire loss is for the other. It is not that watertight a compartment. Next, it completely ignores the order and stability of the society. Of course, the society is stable and ordered. There is conflict, no doubt, but there is also stability, there is also equilibrium. But the conflict theorists completely ignore that. The conflict theorists were ideologically extremely radical because they rose suddenly out of the criticism towards the structural functionalist theory. And also, to some extent, because of this sudden ideological radicalism, they were also somewhat underdeveloped. This theory of conflict were not fully developed. They were not mature enough. So these were the criticisms that were faced by the conflict theorists after they put forth their arguments. Summing up, the classical conflict theories are macro-historical. What do I mean by macro-historical? They focus on the larger evolutionary social change and also why that evolution is occurring, the causes. They do not focus at all on everyday micro-study of conflict. They do not take those into account. Conflict theory studies social organization and social behavior, and it differs methodologically. Somewhere it is macro, and in the later stages of conflict theory, in the contemporary conflict theories, we will see that it does take into account the empirical, experience-based studies. Especially useful in the study of inequality, stratification, and hierarchy. It is actually applicable to the removal of such inequalities. It tries to do away with such social inequalities which come through stratification and hierarchy. The conflict theorists take conflict as a normal and inherent condition of social relationships and organizations. It is embedded within the society. Just as order is embedded, so is conflict. That is what the conflict theorists would argue. In the society, there are changes, and it changes its structural organization, how it is structurally organized from one state of maintenance and order and stability to another state of maintenance of order and stability. Now remember who talked about the maintenance of stability and order? The structural functionalists. Now conflict theory criticized them to build their theory in the first place. However, they came back over and over to the structural functionalist idea and actually could not completely free themselves of the previous theory that they themselves criticized. So this was basically what the classical conflict theorists contributed during their times. Thank you.